I'm going to set a gentle chime for myself at 10. This has been such a weird gathering. I've experienced a lot of confusion, and I'm going to try to amp that up for you today. So I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in collective knowing and knowledge and the limits of that. I'm going to talk about plurality, diversity, and disconnection. I'm at the University of Chicago and Santa Fe Institute. So plurality, I'm rendering, at least for myself, as distributed and decentralized cognition, engagement, exchange, where machines complement and loosely integrate humanity and nature, and the problems or challenges are kind of care and cultivation of diversity in the system. I see this other pole as the least interesting in some ways, as on the continuum, a singularity of centralized machines that accelerate and supersede humanity with existential challenges of control. I see this as unlikely, at least in my human time scale, but this singularity I see as a really meaningful pole that we should think about plurality in contraposition with. So massively networked humanity that collapses to singular values, singular standards, with an evolutionary failure to adapt to emerging challenges. And I think this is much closer. We've seen diversity collapse in other domains. We see a collapse of playlists and usage over the internet. We see language extinction with social contact. We see biological extinctions occur at massive levels with ecological contact between systems. So this is much more likely. And we see it also in the context of science. This is a place that I've looked at systematically where as fields grow, we have an exponential decline in the likelihood that new things enter the canon of the conversation. So this is one other pole against which we need to kind of explore and lean into plurality. And the other is polarity, right? Where we've got separated, but centralized and disconnected, often effectively disconnected, which is desiring to disconnect connections where machines become weaponized in battles for control, and diversity really becomes erased in these battles over singular or group-level identities. And this is highly likely. We see it manifesting, and we see institutions like Wikipedia, was just mentioned last time, that can fight against it through balancing some of these diversities. One of the things we've looked at is how political diversity in the context of contributions ends up being systematically associated with quality of posts in these spaces. And in a poster session by Jinsol Kim in my lab, we look at vigilante misinformation checking on the web. What happens is typically when people are slapped with a fact check online and Twitter, they end up, that's the moment at which they're the most diverse in their information seeking, and their slapping causes them to retreat back into their bubble. So it does the opposite of kind of spanning them out. Whereas a balanced system like Birdwatch, which has been renamed to something like people will know, community opinions or whatever it is, it uses a diversity balance system, and it systematically does the opposite. It actually draws people to search out and consume information that's more broad. So I'm going to talk about some desiderata, some open problems that I think are critical in thinking about plurality against these two poles, which is building a real science of diversity and connectivity that facilitates sustainable diversity in these systems. It's inspired by biological phenomena like hybrid vigor, which requires distance between populations such that genetic interaction between those populations become possible. It's inspired by science, where abduction or surprise systematically is associated with advance. So this is kind of like over historical time, science is reaching further and further to solve their problems with other sciences. Or if you predict the most likely next thing that's going to be discovered, then you take the inverse of that, and that is the best ex-ante predictor of attention in the system. So these are surprise-driven systems, and those surprises come systematically not from unusual individuals, but from unusual groups, from expeditions of groups of people from one part of the space who solve problems by people in other parts of the space. And we see this also in the context of reproduction and replication. More diversity in the system, both social diversity and methodological diversity, is systematically associated with the likelihood that things will replicate out of the experimental system in which they were discovered. So this is my class of questions that I think are steps towards a science of sustainable plurality and sustainable diversity. So 1 is discovering diversity. 2 is coordinating diversity. 3 is thinking about and discovering, kind of coaching or cultivating novel diversities and designing diversity. This is kind of a new vision or a vision for thinking about AI, not as artificial, but as kind of alien or alternative intelligence. And also theorizing connection and connectivity with dynamic measurements and incorporation for plurality. And I'll speak a little bit less about that given the limits of time here. So the first program is discovering diversity, to seek out new life and civilizations, new values, new objectives, and new contexts, really surveying the space of cognitive, perceptual, material, kind of human capacity, experiential identity differences that exist in the world such that we can understand how to conserve them for benefit. We can discover them through disagreements, like using jury learning systems and doing prediction in ways that conflicts with one another, through disconnection, things that should connect but they're not connecting, and through adversarial direct search, like reinforcement learning, where we're just systematically learning biases from folks in the system. A second thing is about coordinating optimal diversity given the space of diversities. How can we figure out the range of diversities that matter for a class of problems? I've looked at this in the context of teams and fields, but there are many, many other contexts that these are relevant. And it suggests questions like, how does collective size of the community matter? It does matter in the team context. How does it matter in these other contexts? How does collective structure matter? So hierarchical nature of these structures dramatically influences the diversity of the outcomes. How does the composition matter? Not just the range or the diversity across the space, but also really even the tiling of expertise across these spaces has dramatic implications for how it is that diversity gets activated. How is randomness incorporated, like aleatory diversity? It turns out that in many contexts it ends up destabilizing what are otherwise kind of locked-in collective positions. And realizing that not all diversity is equal. These are kind of algorithmic evolutionary experiments that discover that very different kinds of diversity are relevant for very different kinds of tasks in these spaces. So this assembling optimal diversities leads us to think about the importance of conserving diversities for assemblage. Like if we network all the communities, then we've got the risk of collapse into a singular space that basically destroys all the potential energy and potential difference that's available. A third approach is coaching diversity. So, if assemblage is about found diversity, coaching is about cultivated diversity. So how do we think about revisioning a kind of a science of skill and learning that transcends the notion of universal additivity, where everything doesn't decrease the value of other experiences and expertise. Right? So if we understand that certain ideas and ways of thinking and skills end up decreasing the value of others, then we can really start to optimize the way in which we skill and cultivate difference and specialization. And this facilitates ways of thinking about machine teaching and machine translation. Fourth, designing diversity that increases collective capacity. So what kind of AI do we want? Do we want an AI that kind of paints a bullseye on the back of human capacity that really is focused on basically human moves or human outcomes? Or do we want to think about building something that thinks complementary or in a complementary way to kind of human capacity? And one example is a recent system that we developed to kind of maximize the prediction of discovery in a number of material science and pharmacological cases, which you can do by taking into account where people are in this space, such that virtually all of our predictions end up being true. I mean, we're predicting kind of who's going to discover what function or property of certain materials in these spaces. But this is a scoop machine. Like, this is totally uninteresting to the community. All you're going to do as a function of this system is destroy the capacity of individuals on whose data you're building this answer. And you can invert this, basically, to kind of systematically move outside the system to triage, right, or arbitrage against these high-dimensional holes in expertise space and discover things that would never be discovered or asked by people as a function of the diversity of their experience. And this pushes us to rethink the problem of AI as a control problem to a problem that Alison Goplik and Patricia Churchland have reframed as a care problem. How do we cultivate diverse capacities? My time is so up. So I'm going to close it down just by saying, hey, we also need to measure diversity, and we can't reduce those measurements to low-dimensional measurements. It turns out the graph measurements, they systematically miss the fact that groups are hyper-edges. They're high-dimensional edges, and measuring them in these high-dimensional ways fundamentally change the way in which we think about spread. And we need to move from metrics to models and from discrete to continuous spaces to measure not only what's connecting, but the probability of connections that are going to be made, right, according to these spaces. So, and then everyone else has talked about incorporating these things into certainty and whatever else. It's over, but there we go. Thanks so much, and I look forward to chatting.